I want to begin with a set of questions because I'm not certain how I want to pitch what I want to say. So I'm going to begin with my questions, and by the time I finish them, maybe I'll figure out how I want to pitch what I want to say. So what is the work of nation, and what is the work of the state, and what is the work of the nation state when we put the two together? So I want to recognize that Canadian studies and Canadian history, in particular professional Canadian history, has been engaged in the 60s for about a decade now, with conferences and edited collections that have attempted to speak to different moments in the Canadian state, in the Canadian nation, when something seemed to erupt that marked the 60s as a particular kind of turning point for the Canada that we presently occupy. And I really want to wonder about what that is, because for the most part, um, those moments have been um, monochromatically marked as white, except for in a small few instances. And so I hope that maybe this weekend we can think about that a little bit. And having said that, then I want to say that what I think I want to say here is that when you bring blackness and black people to this question, that it begins to haunt the white Canadian 60s in a very particular way. So if my comments represent anything conceptual and theoretically, I offer you a kind of hauntology of both this event and previous events. And because I think that excising blackness really limits what it is that we can see back into the past and what becomes possible for future transformations. And the comments that I'm making here are based upon a paper that, and some thinking that I began to do in 2009 when Joan Sangster organized a long 60s conference at Princeton. um, and, and in that long 60s conference, I tried to think about the place of black people in which is quickly developing as a kind of 60s studies of Canada, and particular kind of 60s studies that kind of make sense of where we are in contemporary Canada. And what I find most interesting in all of these conversations is the blackness sits alongside, is almost never mentioned, but never articulated as a part of the very thing that we're undertaking. Um, And I say that because I think that when we think about the question from Diefenbaker to Trudeau, when we think about this question of the just society that Trudeau articulated, in fact, black activism took up that rhetoric in a very particular way and pushed the nation state and the state to account for its claim of a just society in very particular ways, both through the labor movement, but through immigration and through a bunch of other things that I'm going to hopefully get to. So, in the last little while, and it's really interesting who becomes the touchstones for thinking these moments. In the last while, there've been a number of important works written by black Canadians. I'm going to quote from one in a second. And while the one that I'm going to point to, while he and I have both political and conceptual differences about how we think about the Canadian nation state, Cecil Foster has written 3 books taking up the 60s and the just society as a place to think through the politics of how we arrive at contemporary Canada. And it's notable that his work is almost never engaged with on these questions. And I think that that's something that we should really ask ourselves deeply about. In fact, his last book, which just came out, is a book on the sleeping car porters that attempts to, again, take up the rhetoric of the just society, rethink it, and I think in some ways, I fundamentally disagree with some of his moves, but in some ways seeks to extend it as the very foundations of what becomes a multicultural Canadian society. But I'm going to turn to David Austin, and I want to simply read a brief quote from David Austin's Fear of a Black Nation, Race, Sex, and Security in 60s Montreal. And he's writing of the genealogies of black experience. And he says, uncovering the genealogy of these narratives involves the arduous task of burying the master narratives and unearthing narratives that have been buried. And among those hidden treasures are movements like the ascendancy of black politics in the 1960s and events like the Congress of Black Writers and the Sir George Williams Affair. Black politics in the 1960s not only confronted the master narratives and the racial assumptions upon which they were based, but challenged the institutional apparatus that the narratives were serving and perpetuating. And I think even radical conferences like this one can often reproduce a very particular kind of story of Canada. So I speak here not as a non-historian. I'm a user of history. And so what I want to do for the rest of my time is to kind of try to make a conceptual and political claim and a shift about the order of knowledge and the uses of history. And to do that, I want to turn to which in this larger paper I call Black Gifts. And these are marked as 1, an eruption, 2, an erasure, and 3, a gift. So the first gift is the Sir George Williams Affair of 69, which is an erupture. And for those of you who don't know much about the Sir George Williams Affair, it's a student occupation that begins really in 1967. It's dragged into 68, and then really erupts in 69. Students occupy the computer room of Sir George Williams, which is now called Concordia. And this leads to a certain kind of conflagration in which that ends in the destruction of the computer center, ends in arrest, and so on. And I invoke Sir George because I think that if we were to articulate Sir George with the decriminalization at the same time, it asks us to begin to think about where do we find black queer people in these narratives? And how might professional historians begin to find black queer people in these narratives? How might Canadian studies begin to think about the terms of its conceptual claims of how we come to understand contemporary Canada? And so, well, I don't want to go into too much detail, but because I want to move to the other two and then stage another set of questions. Part of what I'm trying to say here is that what we've seen as we've come to think these moments is that we've seen even a kind of unconscious recapitulation of the white nation state of Canada. Because we cut these moments off from other kinds of activism, other kinds of policy claims and policy stakes that are being made at the same time. And if we articulated them together, I think something more fruitful and more interesting will come to the fore. Number 2, in 1967, what I call this one the gift, Canada receives the gift of Caribana. Now, anybody who knows anything about carnivals, they know that in carnivals, queer life lives. And so one of the things that's interesting to me is the way in which the 60s is restaged. That Caribana is never ever taken up as a site of possibility for a whole range of ways of thinking about questions of the rhetoric of a good society. I mean, it's offered up as a gift. It comes to be grief for black people, post-60s, which is an interesting way to account for it. And it continues to be a certain kind of metaphor for how we might think about the ways in which black life in Canada is both hyper-visible and simultaneously made invisible. The third is Africville. For those of you who are familiar with the history of Africville, you know that by 69, at least, well, there's still demolitions after 69, but by 69, the Seaview Church is entirely razed, which marks the full destruction of Africville. Now we know that in that destruction, that queer life had to be disrupted too. So at the same moment that the partial decriminalization is happening, black communities and black queer life is being disrupted as well. So we have an eruption, we have an erasure, and we have a gift. And I mean, Dana Inkster's still wonderful 14-minute film, Welcome to Africville, is the only work that I know that attempts to place black queer life in that narrative. But what I'm suggesting here today is that maybe this is a narrative that needs to be also placed inside of the partial decriminalization of homosexuality in Canada. And I offer these 3 moments as a way to ask us to think about when can black queer life be accounted for and when it can't be accounted for? Can it only be accounted for in terms of a logic of visibility, or can it be accounted for in terms of the ways in which broader acts of black activism throughout the 60s clearly had to be also accounting for queer lives. And if we come to the work that we do from that particular kind of conceptual space, what would it do for the studies that those of us who are professional academics engage in? So I want to make a plea then for not cutting off black organizing from other kinds of policy interventions and organizing. I want to make a plea to professional historians to not cut off black histories of activism from other histories of activism in the Canadian nation state and its ongoing formation or deformation. And today, it really became clear to me when Gary was giving the opening comments, and he made the links between 69 in Canada around decriminalization, Ireland and other places. The thing that has happened is that when we think about black life, because black life in Canada is deeply diasporic, we therefore don't see that then as fundamental Canadian nation-state formation. But what Gary's comments open up for me today is that Canada itself, white Canada itself, is also deeply diasporic in a different way. And that if we can, there's a way in which our studies allow us to notice that doesn't allow us to notice it for others within the nation state. So I don't want to go on too much longer, but I want to make one, the kinds of things that I am limning here and pushing at exist largely in biographies and autobiographies of black Canadians. They exist largely outside of the formal networks of historical knowledge and historical production. And I would say that what these works do is they continue to demonstrate the problem of the modern nation state as an entity that can provide the kinds of rights and freedoms and the possibilities of liberation that so many of us demand, and that my colleague here just said must involve more than two. In fact, that must involve more than two is fundamental to the kinds of black activism that we see in the 60s. That is always collective, it's always broad-based, and it's always challenging the nation state to do something beyond the individual desire for recognition. And so let me conclude by saying that, the kinds of moments that I'm speaking to, they kind of really haunt normative Canadian histories. And they haunt normative Canadian histories that seek to produce a narrative that there's a kind of post-60s Canadian harmony that we're still kind of working out. And what they do is they really accentuate the problem of a certain kind of forgetfulness. So my argument here then is the conceit of my argument here is actually that the 60s in Canada belong to black people. That the 60s in Canada, black activism in the 60s offers a collective response to a wide range of federal policy initiatives that actually impact lives well beyond black communities. We can take the immigration movement from the 50s into the 60s as just one, but I would argue that even things like, the destruction of Africville is a moment that gets repeated across urban areas, so it becomes a model for thinking about how we might think about contemporary Canada and destruction. And so to place blackness as an articulation of what it is we set out to do will definitely enhance the kind of work that we think we want to do, and will definitely offer us a different way to think about a possible transformative future. So I'll leave it at that.